So good morning, everyone. I'm Conrad with AIM Transportation Solutions. And first off, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. You're all here because CBD usage has exploded over the last 5 years, which unsurprisingly has affected the commercial transportation industry. And as we'll get into later, the CBD industry operates with little regulatory oversight, which can lead to major unintended consequences that can severely impact a driver's career, the company they drive for, and at its most extreme, even put the lives of drivers and other motorists in jeopardy. So to help avoid these unintended consequences as a result of CBD usage, it's important to understand the facts. And to help us navigate this complicated subject, we have AIM Regional Safety Manager John Rugarber here with us. But before I hand the mic over to John, I just want to give a brief rundown of what we do here at AIM. We offer a full menu of commercial fleet services, including full service leasing, commercial truck rentals, maintenance programs, including professional shop management, used truck sales, freight brokerage, and as it most closely relates to our topic today, integrated logistics, also known as dedicated fleet or dedicated contract carriage. So our dedicated fleet service not only provides a company with a vehicle, but we also provide them with a driver for that vehicle. And then we handle hiring and retaining those drivers, as well as dispatching, payroll, compliance, and everything that goes into a transportation operation from top to bottom. This, of course, allows you to put your time, your resources, and your energy into growing your core business while mitigating the liability that goes into managing a fleet, such as avoiding altogether the potential issues stemming from what we'll be covering today. So if by the end of today's presentation, you'd like more information about AIM's dedicated fleet service or any of our other services, please don't hesitate to reach out. That being said, whether you're a customer or not, we wish for nothing but success for you and your business, which is why we want, at the very least, to be a resource for you to lean on. And that's why we're happy to host webinars such as this one, providing you access to our industry experts like Mr. John Rugarber here. So we're going to go ahead and get into it now, but just a couple of things to note. We are recording this session, and in the coming days, you'll receive a follow-up email containing resources, including a link to the recording, as well as John's contact information in case you have any questions down the road. No pun intended there. Finally, we ask that you please save your questions for John until the end, when we will have a Q&A. At that time, you can ask a question by using the chat function, and then I'll go ahead and read those to John, and he can answer them. And so now with that out of the way, John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Conrad. I appreciate it. I'd like to welcome everyone, especially the West Coast, where I guess it's about 7 a.m. in the morning there. So it's an early start to your day. I'd like to thank Conrad and Jess and the whole marketing team for putting on these webinar series and actually inviting the safety department to share some of their expertise and experience in some of the items that have been involved in the transportation industry as we go along. As he'd mentioned, my name is John Rugarber. I'm a regional safety manager with AIM Transportation Solutions. I've been with AIM about 23 years, give or take a few months. Began my career as a driver and worked my way into safety. And basically, I'm semi-retired, but I still enjoy working with AIM and the transportation industry, and kind of took it upon myself to begin to do these webinar series on different subject matters. And so last few months, and even in the last year or so, I began to realize that CBD usage was becoming more and more popular with the general public, and I thought it would be a good subject to look into and talk about. So that's kind of what prompted today's webinar series. So we titled it CBD Usage and Effects on CDL Holders. As can be noted down there on the screen, it's July 25th, 2023. My name is below with the Regional Safety Manager. My email contact is right below that, jrugarber@aimntls.com. So if you'd like any questions that you want to forward to me at any point in time, feel free. I'm always interested in learning from some of the other people in the transportation industry, and that prompts me to go find answers if I do not have the answers. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to get back to you or start a conversation with you. So let's get started. All right, so today's focus is going to be on cannabis, which is known normally as marijuana. We're going to talk about some hemp issues. Where this all started from is the hemp product. We're going to talk about some testing criteria and some testing information. And at the end, we're going to cover a little bit of FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse information for some of you that aren't that familiar with it. So before I get started on this, I just want to clarify that I talked to Conrad earlier this morning. This whole marijuana situation and cannabis and hemp in the industry, it changes almost on a daily basis throughout the country. States are working with legislators to try to come up with new rules and regulations, looking for more leniency in the use of these products. So a lot of this information, I tried to make it as current as I could, but literally things can change on a day-by-day basis. There could be legislation in a particular state that could pass this afternoon, and now that particular law has changed. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You'll see some numbers and some dates. For example, cannabis legality by state. I had pulled this information. It was listed as January 13th of 23 was where the information was, at the time it was pulled. So things could have changed since then. I would highly recommend that, dependent upon the individual state that you're in, that you go and research that state a little further if you want more information. But real quickly, if we look up here, we see the three colored blocks. The blue is fully legal use of cannabis or marijuana. Mixed would be where you have recreational use and you also have medicinal use. So there can be some mixed regulations on in those particular states. And then we have the illegal states, which we can call that orange or whatever color you'd prefer to call that. So looking at this map, these squares in here would pretty much identify the United States. As you can see, the coasts are pretty heavy on full legality. Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, so those Western states are generally pretty fully legal. And then we have the East Coast over here where we have New England, looks to be pretty legal. We've got DC over here. And then you have the middle of the country where there's some mixed rules and regulations. That's where, so if you have any fleets or if you're an owner operator on this call, you'd want to go into that individual state and see what their specificity is on legality of the use of it. And then it's pretty easy on these ones, the Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Those are completely illegal. On the legal portion of it, so legality, what does it mean? Well, they can't be arrested, ticketed, or convicted of using within the state's regulations of age, place, and consumption, amount of consumption. Again, it's based on state regulations. Federally, marijuana is not legal. And that's where things get quite confusing and they can get very sticky in that regard. The mixed, again, you can use it for medicinal purposes, yet you cannot use it for recreational purposes. Now, I'm talking in the general public. We haven't gotten to the drivers yet. So don't misinterpret me and think that I'm talking about drivers can be using it. We're going to get to that. But this is kind of the overall legality of marijuana in the country. I found this another country map here, which actually I'll make a few correlations to the previous slide, but it's interesting when you look at the states that smoke the most weed or marijuana. This is on a percentage basis of the population. Has nothing to do with truck drivers per se, but it's based on the population. And not surprisingly, you can see where Washington, Oregon, you got California, Nevada, Montana, Colorado. Over here in the New England states, you got Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, all fall within that 20 to 25% usage rate. So it's not surprising. It really correlates really closely to this dark blue over here that we were talking about. So that makes pretty much sense there. You could see where there's minimal usage, roughly 10%, are the states that either are illegal or, don't have, let's go back to the previous slide. So where they have mixed laws, so you have less usage, that 10% kind of in those particular states. And then obviously the completely illegal states is where you would have the less usage also. Now, one of the things I found interesting though is Virginia. We look at Virginia and West Virginia here, you're showing a 10% usage rate. You go back to the previous slide, you'll see where Virginia actually is fully legal. So it's surprising that even though it's legal in Virginia, only 10% of the population, according to this, are using marijuana. So I just thought that was pretty interesting that they could use it legally if they'd like, but they're choosing not to, and don't know the reason for that. Didn't see any research on why that could have occurred. So for anyone on this call, I think this kind of identifies the states pretty nicely in terms of where you're located. Obviously, if I'm running a fleet out of Vermont, Rhode Island, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, I pay special attention to my prospective employees that are coming in, or even current employees. The propensity to maybe use marijuana seems to be a bit higher in those particular states. Secondarily, if I was in Montana up here, Nevada, California, Oklahoma, Illinois, Michigan, and just that New England area in general, I'd keep a closer eye on my employees. And part of the reason we're doing this is to try to educate your drivers to the CBD usage in marijuana and the connection between the two, so that they don't inadvertently get in trouble and find themselves with a positive test with no recourse. So I just found those pictorials pretty useful. Sometimes people learn or understand better when they see pictures and colors, and I think I may be one of those particular type of people. So, in my research for this, I can't remember how I came up with it. I'm not sure how many people on this call are familiar with a movie called Reefer Madness. I will admit I never saw it, but I've heard about it in my years. It was actually a film that was produced in 1936. And interestingly, the use of marijuana dovetails pretty nicely with the fact that Prohibition began in 1920 and followed through all the way to 1933. And there's some people who think that because of Prohibition, people were looking for alternate ways to experience the feeling that you get when you drink alcohol. And surprisingly, an uptick in marijuana occurred during that particular time. For anybody who's on this call that remembers those years, that's going to put you at a pretty high age group. But back then, the societal thoughts were quite a bit different than they are today. And as you can see by this poster for Reefer Madness, you have a Boris Karloff looking guy up here in the upper corner. Got a young woman who is dancing with drug crazed abandon, it shows. Some victims down here. So it's actually become more of a cult comedy at this point in time. Similar, something maybe along the lines of Rocky Horror Picture Show or some Monty Python stuff. It's just kind of over the top filming of the use of marijuana. Ironically, Kenneth Stroop, back in 1972, purchased this movie for $297 from the Library of Congress. And Mr. Stroop is actually the founder of NORML, which was the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, not surprisingly. So he thought he would purchase this movie and use it as a fundraiser for his organization so that he could build some money and try to get the laws changed to normalize marijuana. So he began to show this in college campuses, and it really caught on in the college campuses. And again, time-wise, it's not surprising. If you think about it, the late 60s, peace, love, and rock and roll, they were coming off of that. So really, when he put this in the colleges, the young people kind of took after it, and it became their cult movie to go see. So I thought it was just an interesting little tidbit to put in there. I came upon it. I really wasn't planning on doing anything with this, and just came upon it, thought it would be interesting. And it's funny how when you go research these things, that it turns out that marijuana isn't a new thing. It's been around for a long time and used by many different cultures for different reasons. So, all right, so let's look at some statistics here. So approximately 52 million Americans have consumed marijuana in 2022. Approximately 51% of millennials, millennials are defined as 27 to 47 years old, have tried marijuana. I put some bullet points on here because the next slide coming up is going to have a little bit of discussion point based on age and tenure within the industry. Next one down, 39 states have legalized high THC medical cannabis. Approximately 74% of Americans, or 248 million, have access to some form of legal marijuana. 91% of Americans favor legalizing marijuana. 67% of physicians favor legalization of medical marijuana. And that last one, I'm covered up by my screen here at the bottom. I think that was, how much money was made. 2022 was about a $30 billion marketplace for cannabis at this point in time. It was supposed to be a little higher. COVID put a little bit of a dent in that. They originally had been talking about 33 to $34 billion worth. It ended up being about 30 billion. If I'm not mistaken, and I can't see in this little corner, I've kind of forgotten my number. I think it was 2023, they're looking at about 37 billion. And actually, I can see this 2028, they're looking at almost 52 billion, I think, in revenue generated from the sales of cannabis. So this isn't something that's going to go away. Anytime you tie things to money, they will tend to keep on going. So just something to keep in the back of our mind as we move forward. And some of these sources, I try to put the source information in there. I know Conrad had offered the white paper out that I guess everyone who signed up probably has the white paper already. There's some more detailed information with some more sources and things at the end. So I do have little notations of sources down these lower corners of the page if you'd like to look further into that information. So here's that age and tenure that I thought would correlate nicely with the previous page in terms of the millennials and the age groups. Now this is pulled from zippia.com. You could probably go on a million different websites and get a little bit different numbers, but I think this will get the conversation started. The average age of a driver in the transportation industry is about 47 years old. We have about 9% that are 20 to 30 years old, and we have about 19% that are 30 to 40 years old. So you're looking at roughly, 28% of the workforce is between the ages of 20 and 40 years old. Down below, again, I pulled this information from the previous page. 51% of millennials, which are 27 to 47, have tried marijuana. So there's a good chance that that group in there has tried marijuana at some point in time. Not that they're actively using it, but they have tried it. So they're familiar with it. Some of them may enjoy it, and they're looking for an opening to continue to enjoy it. They may be aware that they cannot use it while they're driving, but with everything that's going on in the news, all they know is that all they see on the news program last night was that marijuana is now legal in their state. And they decide that they can use marijuana because it's legal in their state, not realizing that it is not legal for a safety sensitive person in the transportation industry. So, you're looking at roughly 1 in 3 drivers probably have tried marijuana at some point in time. I would work really hard on educating and identifying these people in my fleet and try to make sure that they know exactly what the rules and regulations are in their particular state. Number of years on the job itself. So we have 40% of people are less than 1 year in this profession, and 27% are less or between 1 and 2 years. So for all intents and purposes, you're looking at 67% of the drivers are only in this profession for 1 to 2 years, which would indicate to me that they may not have the same incentive or the same care or the same interest in their job that someone like myself or probably anybody on this call has, where we made it a career and we would pay attention to what we're doing. We drive safely, we make the right decisions, we try to remain accident free. We don't do illegal products. So just, I would pay attention to the 1 to 2 year drivers. Really, again, make a big effort to educate them, keep them in the loop on terms of what's legal, what's not legal, the CBD usage versus the marijuana usage. You know, you can't give them enough education. Whether they accept it or not is another story. But you know, we as professionals and as owners and drivers should try to make that as that education is as good as we can. The 3 or 4 year person is probably trying to decide whether to make it a career. Probably doesn't want to jeopardize his career, so chances of him maybe experimenting are a little less. Once you're in the industry for 5 to 7, you probably know what's going on at that point in time. You realize that marijuana is illegal, that CBD usage is not worth the risk of possibly getting caught, and you're beginning to build a career. So I don't know if I'd be as concerned so much with that age group as the ones that I talked about just a few minutes ago. All right, so is marijuana legal at the federal level? The definitive answer is no. Federal law classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. You can call it CSA, but don't get that confused with the Compliance, Safety, and Accountability account that came into play back in December of 2010. That's not the same at all. So that means that the government doesn't recognize its medical use and considers it a substance of high risk for abuse. Possessing, growing, transporting, and or distributing marijuana is illegal on a federal level. So how did we get to this point in time? So in December of 2018, the legalization of hemp under the Farm Bill was introduced. I'm not sure who introduced the individual bill, but for some of the people that grow crops, it was a big deal. So I know Senator Paul Rand, a Republican out of Kentucky, had some effort in keeping this going and getting things going on. There's going to be something coming up here in the next few slides where I'm going to reference him again. But in December 18 is really where it all began, when they legalized the use of hemp. So they have legalized it by effectively removing hemp from the definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substance Act. Hemp is part of the cannabis sativa family of plants, but the amount of THC in the particular plant is where it defines how it's going to fall within the range of being legal or illegal. So they removed hemp from that definition. And that's how this all began, where hemp became legal. It didn't take long for manufacturers of CBD to decide that they wanted to make a product that they could sell to make money on. And that's all of a sudden the use and the manufacturing of CBD became something to look at. So really, the differences are, what you're looking at, Delta 8 versus Delta 9. This Delta 9 is actually the THC that marijuana falls under and that is illegal in today's current law. Delta 8 is what some call the watered down version of THC. It's a milder form of THC. I would think that most of us have went into a store, a 7-Eleven, independent stores. There's many places today, hundreds, thousands of places that will sell CBD, and you'll see Delta 8 on some of the bottles or the boxes or whatever they're selling, gummies or edibles. They'll refer to it as Delta 8. That's because the Delta 8 is the more mild version of THC, and technically it is legal. And let's find out why it's legal. If I have any chemists on this call or medical doctors, bear with me because I'm not a chemist and I'm not a medical doctor, but I thought it was interesting that something so small could be so significant. This is a chemical structure. It's the chemical structure of Delta 8. And I have to say this slow, the tetrahydrocannabinol versus the Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And this is where you can really get pretty far into the woods, but we're not going to get that far. I'm just going to make a quick review of this. If you could see right here, this little yellow line, the double chemical bond is on the 8th or the 9th atom. And ironically, where it is placed makes the entire difference in terms of whether you're dealing with Delta 9 or the Delta 8 version of THC. Again, the Delta 8 at this point in time is legal, and I think the next slide is going to explain why it's legal. The Delta 9 is considered the more high potency THC, and subsequently CBD that has that version of THC in it will be considered illegal and will result in a positive drug screen if you get pulled in for a random post-accident or anything of that nature. So Delta 8 THC levels. The current limit is 0.3%. And that's why it's legal. Anything above 0.3% is the illegal version of THC. And that is where the bill, as long as the production of THC, that portion of THC is at 0.3%, that product is technically legal. And that was the area that the manufacturers jumped on to be able to manufacture CBD. So when the plants are pulled, and again, this is going really far into the woods, but the growth period, the time in the fields, all have something to do with the amount of THC that's in the particular product. Now, this is, again, I'm going to mention his name again, Senator Paul Rand is actually proposing at this point in time that the limit be raised to 1%. Because being out of Kentucky, a lot of I don't know a lot, but there's farmers who are growing this product for a profit. And they're having a difficult time trying to get it out of the field before it turns into the illegal product due to environmental factors. Being in the field too long, the growing process can change it. And they're referring to it as a hot product. If it gets above the 0.3%, the product needs to be destroyed. They can't even transport it because at that point in time, it's become an illegal substance. So they can't put it on a truck and transport it because they're basically transporting marijuana at that point in time. So there is some discussion. The Hemp Act of let's see, March of 21 is when it's been proposed. It doesn't show any particular progress on it at this point in time, but it has been proposed, and they're talking about trying to raise the limit to 1%, which would really put a whole nother bent on this situation, because now any CBD product with 1% is going to be illegal. So, and if it's sold out in the park, in the public, in stores, and if a person doesn't know, they could get themselves in quite a bit of trouble by taking that product. So what are some of the effects on the body? So one of the effects are euphoria. So it's a feeling of happiness and excitement, which could be good. It's not a bad thing necessarily to be happy, but the excitement portion of it probably is not a real good thing if you're a truck driver traveling in densely populated areas in large cities. You want to try to keep that excitement level down and try to keep your thoughts about you. So euphoria in and of itself can be a good thing, but you don't want to be experiencing huge amounts of euphoria while you're driving a commercial motor vehicle. Let me go back to that one. Relaxation, the state of being free from tension and anxiety. Probably similar to alcohol. Everybody enjoys a beer once in a while. Smokers, they smoke to relieve the tension, the anxiety. Those products are currently legal, but marijuana is not. So again, the relaxation could be the end result use of CBD. Then we have visual distortion. I didn't want to fall too far into the reefer madness thing, and I can't believe that my vision would be distorted that much. But visual distortion is not something that we want to experience driving an 80,000-pound vehicle on any particular roadway. We want our vision to be as good as it possibly can be. So again, the Delta 8 version that's 0.3 is a milder version of THC, and it is legal. But you get above that and you could be, your vision could get distorted. Just your mindset changes, and we can't have that while you're driving a vehicle down the road. And difficulty thinking and speaking. In our particular job on the road, maybe speaking isn't that big of a deal, but thinking is a huge deal in driving a commercial motor vehicle on the road. We make thousands of decisions in the course of a day. Some so small that we don't even know we're making them, others quite large. So to not be able to think clearly and concentrate and comprehend things that are going on around you is huge. You need to constantly be thinking, constantly be aware of what's going on around you and make the proper decisions. So the use of any particular illegal product, whether it be alcohol, marijuana, or CBD that you thought was legal but turns out not to be legal, could have a huge impact on your driving and your career. So let's look at some CDC and FDA items real quick. Back in September of 21, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or otherwise known as CDC, they were advising caution when purchasing Delta 8 products. Ironically, there is no oversight at this point in time on these products. Anyone on this call, if you had the wherewithal to go about and figure out how to manufacture CBD, you could do it with really no oversight. You could say that you put out the product and it has a 0.3 limit, but really no one is checking to see if you're correct or not. It may be at 0.7, which has now become marijuana, technically illegal. You put it out in a 7-Eleven, somebody purchases it and gets tested and tests positive. In January of 2023, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, indicated a need for better regulation because of this. Now, ironically, when it falls into the illegal portion of marijuana, the DEA steps in. Since this is not illegal, because it's at 0.3, the Food and Drug Administration is the one that handles the regulation of this particular product. As everyone's probably well aware, any government entity is quite overtaxed at this point in time, and the Food and Drug Administration does not have the personnel to really follow up in any considerable manner in the markings or the manufacturing of these products. So it's really incumbent upon the end user to be aware of what's going on. So let's talk about some testing information. So drug testing today, it's both sophisticated and very accurate in its testing, the way they test. It identifies specific molecules that, if shown to be present, will make the test go further into a secondary test to confirm what those particular molecules are and how much in volume it is. This is pulled as of February 18th of 2020. The DOT Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy and Compliance notice. If anybody would like, you can go in. I put the link underneath. You can use justicetransportation.gov, and that will get you into this. You could find this particular compliance notice. Now, I summarized 3 of the most important points, which number 1, DOT requires testing for marijuana, not CBD. Number 2, there's no federal oversight of certification, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago. And also, CBD is not a legitimate explanation for a positive drug test result. And that's really important, because a driver who has taken CBD, gets pulled in for a random or even pre-employment, they think they can do it because they're really not, they've just become a truck driver, and they test positive. They'll say, all it was CBD that I picked up at the local neighborhood store. That is not a legitimate explanation for a positive test. And then actually down below, and I've lost the last line of this because of that bottom screen, but that is pulled directly from the compliance notice. Since the use of CBD products could lead to a positive drug test result, DOT regulated safety sensitive employees should, I think it says something like, use extreme caution when purchasing these particular products or something like that. So that item down there that's kind of covered, that was pulled directly from the notice itself. And again, if anybody wants to follow up further, go to transportation.gov and you can look at the whole notice, maybe print it out and hand it out to your fleet. So the big question is, will I test positive? If you don't do it, the answer is a definitive no. If you have tried CBD or you do purchase it or you're currently using it, that question should be asked every time you use it because you're not sure. So testing will look for trace amounts of the delta-9 THC, which again is the more potent version of THC, and that's the one that will show up in the test that will end up in a positive result. The delta-8, it's called delta-8 because it's a milder version, and it's at that 0.3 threshold, hopefully. Again, delta-8 CBD, it is a form of THC, although it's a milder form of THC. And if manufactured at the proper facility with the proper, manufacturing process and is within that 0.3 range, will be legal. Problem is, we don't know if it's been manufactured properly and if the number that they put on there is the true number. So that being said, a positive test could result from delta-8 usage. And then I'll reiterate once again that 0.3% is the current level for legality of CBD. Oh, here's where things get a little interesting. Now, this was pulled from the clearinghouse, the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse that began back in January 6th of 2020. So it kind of makes sense that this begins in 2020 here. I pulled it down here. You can see where it's pulled from the clearinghouse monthly report. The positive drug tests account for 82% of total violations reported. So let's look real quick at some of the substances, but really the only one I want to focus on is the marijuana metabolite, or delta-9 THC. So in 2020, there were 29,511 positive tests. 2021, there were 31,085. Doesn't seem like a big jump necessarily. on a percentage basis, probably not, 5.3%. For you fleet owners out there, your fuel costs go up 5.3%. You may be able to pass that on to the consumer and not really experience that much of a hardship from that percentage. Although we look here at 2022, now it jumped up to 40,916 positive tests. Let's look at the percentage increase there. So now you're looking at a 31.6% increase from 2021 and a 38% increase roughly from 2020. So now if I was paying 38% more for fuel than I was 2 years ago, that would be something that would make me sit up in my chair and take notice. So I'm making the comparison to fuel, but this is drivers that have tested positive. The numbers obviously have not come out for 2023, but it's going to be really interesting to see what the numbers are for 2023 as more states legalize the use of marijuana, and if that threshold of 1% gets changed for the use of CBD. So let's look at some now. If any of you are familiar with the Trucking Alliance, it's an organization in the transportation industry. There's some large carriers, JB Hunt, KLLM, Knight, Maverick, Swift. They're members of the Alliance, and they do hair testing. There's been some discussion about whether hair testing should be mandated at this point. It is not. The feds only look for urine testing, although, again, there is some discussion. Comparing the hair and urine test results, and this is from the Trucking Alliance of 2021, the number of positive tests was at 4,362 versus the urine was only 403. So there's almost a 3,959 tests that were found positive through hair testing versus urine. The percentage that was positive, 5.16% versus roughly 0.5%, 0.46, almost 11 times greater was found in hair testing versus urine. And the number of positive tests that contain marijuana, which is kind of where we're talking about today, 1,994 versus 319. So again, they found 1,675 more tests positive for marijuana through the use of hair testing. Now, granted, hair testing is more expensive and it is not mandated at this point in time, but you can see that the ability to find more positive tests increases dramatically using hair testing. So just, again, throwing out some information, kind of found it interesting that it was that big of a difference. And if anyone would like to go on, that Trucking Alliance website has some really good information that you can look into also to go further with this. So let's talk about the Federal Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. Take a few moments and see what's going on over there. So the clearinghouse contains information about holders of commercial driver's licenses and commercial learner permits also, who are covered by FMCSA's drug and alcohol testing program. So they basically record information in that program. There are some consents that need to be given by the drivers for an employer to go in and see some records. There are queries. In other words, the ability for an employer to go in and look at a particular driver's history of drug and alcohol convictions possibly. And it's really was one more added benefit to put safety into the program or into the transportation industry. So that's the purpose of it. It began, I think I'd mentioned January 6th of 2020. So we basically have about a 3-year run of that clearinghouse product now. This falls under Part 382, Controlled Substances and Alcohol Use and Testing. More specifically, 382.701, Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. If anybody wants to look up that in your FMCSR book, those are the numbers. So January 6th of 2023, what was that particular date all about? Let's take a look. So on that date, 3 years of violation data has become available in the clearinghouse, and a pre-employment clearinghouse query will satisfy the requirement to investigate whether a prospective driver had previous drug and alcohol program violations as required by 49 CFR 391.23E. So again, a lot of numbers, but they're in there, so we can always reference those numbers as needed. So there was a loophole in the clearinghouse, and this loophole has recently changed. So let's see how it's changed. So a drug or alcohol violation reported by another employer after a pre-employment or an annual query, but before the next annual one. Okay, so previously, you may have had a driver come in and apply for a job who had went to a previous employer and realized he was going to test positive, maybe walked away from the job, came to you. You don't know if he had failed his drug screen or not. You wouldn't have the result that quickly. They've recently closed that loophole, so now the clearinghouse will now notify employers if there's a change to a driver's clearinghouse record during the 30-day period following a query. So if you go down and you look at the regulation, it can be a little vague. I'm understanding it to mean that if you do an annual query, obviously the pre-employment query for sure, but even an annual query, if something comes up positive 30 days in that 30-day period after that query, the clearinghouse will notify the employer. You won't have to wait until you do your next annual, which could be 11 months later, and you find out that that gentleman had tested positive for a drug screen that you weren't aware of. So that's been a recent loophole that they changed. You can look into that further. And this next page is going to give you the number 382.701C down here at the bottom. But so these queries fall under 382.701A is the pre-employment query required. Everyone should be doing that prior to hiring their employee. The employee also has to give consent for that. We got 382.701B, which is the annual query required, and then 382.701C, and that's the one that has closed that particular loophole. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. I want to thank everybody. I think we're at about 50 minutes for this. Probably went through it quickly. It's quite a big overview. This could have went on for days, probably, this webinar, if I really wanted to get into the details. I tried to keep it as relatively simple as I could and understandable and identify some of the more important points. I think the one big takeaway would be education of drivers. We want to educate our drivers and anybody that's in a safety sensitive function about the use of CBD and how that it could impact their career in the industry. Unbeknownst to them, they think they may be legal. So in their mind, they're not doing anything wrong. So we as the overseers of them need to give them all the information they may need. Let them know that CBD is not a product that you'd want to try randomly, that marijuana is still illegal on a federal level for transportation drivers. So really education is a huge part of what we do and what we should be doing with our drivers and our safety sensitive teams. So I hope that I gave you enough information to at least pique your interest and do some further investigation. For those of you who are already doing this and are very aware of what's going on, I congratulate you, but it can be a very confusing subject for someone who doesn't spend a lot of time on it, and it is not their sole focus. If you're trying to run a company, a small company, and it's you and maybe some other person, it could be quite difficult, I'm sure. The larger companies obviously have teams that support them, but it's those small and mid-range companies where sometimes things slip between the proverbial cracks. So again, I want to thank the AIM marketing team. I really enjoy doing these. Any feedback or anything, feel free to contact me at that email below. Again, I'm always interested in learning as much as I am giving these webinars. So if any of you professionals out there have additional insight to this information, feel free to give me a holler, and I'll be more than happy to put the notes in my file and continue on. So again, thank you very much. I appreciate it and hope to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, John. And we're actually gonna open the floor up for questions, and we had a few come through during the webinar. So let me pull those up. So I think you kind of answered this at the end here, John. But this one's from Tom Quimby, and he asks, given increased legalization and acceptance of both THC and CBD use, has this become more of an education issue among companies that wish to guard against their use?
Well, like you mentioned, I think that I've emphasized the fact that education is probably the number one thing that you need to do. Again, a lot of drivers, and we talked about the millennial portion, who all they tend to see is the fact that it's legal. That's all they happen to see on that big disclaimer was legality. They don't look any further than that. It's funny, when I was researching this, I didn't think to go into some of the entry-level driver training program for new drivers coming in, or reach out to some of my contacts at schools and see how much emphasis they're putting on this particular product. I'm actually, after the webinar, I'm going to reach out in the next few days to some of the schools that I talk to and ask them how much information they're giving new drivers coming into the industry in terms of this CBD usage and marijuana usage. I hope it's just not a general overview of don't use marijuana. I hope they're going into more detail, but yes, education is huge, and I would hope that we are all educating our drivers.
All right, and then we have another question from an anonymous attendee. They ask, what about employees that hold a CDL but are not a driver? So I guess, how does that impact them?
If you're within that safety sensitive function, you would be subject to drug screening. So a safety sensitive forklift driver, a warehouse worker who is working in an environment that falls under a safety sensitive area, were pulled in for random. They just ate a gummy bear this morning that's a CBD that they thought was okay to use, and it's above the 0.3% threshold, and now they've tested positive for a drug screen. So anybody that falls within that safety sensitive portion of their job title would fall into this, regardless of whether you are a driver or not.
All right. We have another one from an anonymous attendee. Can you use Delta 8 and not lose your job since it's legal if you are tested and THC shows up?
It is legal if the rate is at 0.3% or less. So you try a CBD product and you get tested for a random or pre-employment. You try it on Saturday morning, and on Monday you go in for a test and you test positive, and it comes up at 0.4%. You've effectively tested positive for drug use. And as I mentioned, I forgot what number slide it was, those from the DOT compliance notice, the driver or person will say, well, I use CBD that I bought at the store. I bought it at Walmart. How could it be illegal? It is. And that's not an excuse. That will show as a positive test when it is reported back from the testing facility. So that 0.3% is the cutoff line. And that's why it's concerning what they're going to do if that 1% proposal from Senator Rand goes through and they raise it to 1%. That's going to put a whole nother different criteria on this whole subject matter. But at the moment, if it's below 0.3%, yes, they will be fine. They will not test positive. It's when it's above the 0.3%.
Okay, thanks, John. And then another one from Tom Quimby. He asked, is DOT or any other federal agency expressing more concern about the increased use of synthetic THC?
I don't know specifically. I mean, I had to kind of dig a little bit for a lot of this information. It wasn't readily available. I'm not seeing big headlines in the transportation industry about CBD usage. There are articles, some magazine, Overdrive, some of the larger commercial carrier journal. I've seen articles. It doesn't seem to be a huge thing at the moment. But that one slide where I brought up the percentages are increasing exponentially. So I can't even imagine what the number is going to be. I mean, if it finds out that half the tests are positive, you're looking at 50 or 60% now in 2023 are testing positive for marijuana. I would think at some point in time, it would become a huge issue. It doesn't seem to be a huge issue at this point. But as the numbers continue to rise and more states legalize marijuana, and if we get that additional 1% increase in potency, I could see it becoming an issue. But the short answer at the moment, it doesn't feel as though it's a huge issue in the industry. It's an issue to be aware of, but I don't know if it would be considered a huge issue. And as far as the synthetic versus any other type, it's to get the 8, it needs to be processed and synthesized. So that may be what you meant by the synthetic portion of it. It takes a chemical process to get that legal THC out of there. They do use product and heat to synthesize it. Left to its own devices, and that's where that hot product came into play. If they let the plant grow out in the field, the environmental portion of that will make the plant more potent. And that's why they're trying to raise that, because it's very difficult for the growers to control the environmental factors, the heat, the sun, the rain. So some of the articles I've read where farmers will go in and pull their crop, and it could be legal at the point in time, but it's still growing, it's still maturing. By the time it gets to market, it's risen above that 0.3 threshold, and now for all intents and purposes, it's no longer any good, and it needs to be destroyed. And that was part of what prompted that bill by Senator Rand to try to help the farmers, give them a little bit more leeway in harvesting their crop. So again, it's a pretty complicated subject. There's a lot of things going on in this. So I hope I answered your question.
Thanks, John. Got another one here. A driver gets into an accident and tests positive for THC, though he says he only uses the drug recreationally and hadn't been using at the time of the collision. He's been with the fleet for several years and has had a safe and productive driving history. Grounds for termination nonetheless?
Most likely, yes. He's tested positive for a drug screen. He'd have to go through the entire return to work process, which is a huge process in and of itself. But yes, I know at AIM, if you have a positive drug screen, termination is a given. I'm sure there's many other companies. I'm sure there's many people on this call that have a similar policy. It's a zero tolerance policy. So yes, regardless, it's a shame, regardless of their past history. But yes, it would be termination. The liability for not doing it would be too great were something to happen later on again. Mm-hmm. To find out that you've kept someone who tested positive previously, the liability is huge. So I venture to say the termination is a given.
All right, thanks, John. Another one here. If someone tries legal CBD and has a positive drug test, what should they do?
There's nothing for them to do. they've tested positive. They're gonna get the call from the MRO, and he's gonna say that you've tested positive, and you're gonna respond that I used CBD that I bought at Walmart or 7-Eleven or any reputable place. And he's going to say it's a shame, but it doesn't matter. You've tested positive. It was above that 0.3% threshold. And that's the issue that comes into play. You're looking at a bottle that was sold in Walmart that because it's in Walmart, you're taking for granted it's legal. How could it not be legal? And they're selling it to the general public. It's understandable. The problem is it wasn't manufactured by a legitimate company that had the proper process. So they manufactured it, put it on the shelf, and it's got a 0.6% limit, or it's at 0.6% in the THC level, which is above that 0.3. And it's funny, now that this is the third time I've heard this question, it even goes to show how important it is to tell the drivers or anyone in this industry that CBD usage is very dangerous. You don't know if you're getting legal CBD or not at this point in time. It's not worth the risk.
Right. All right. Another question here. Has kratom use been looked at yet for CDL holders?
It has. And thank you. Whoever asked that question, thank you very much for that question, because in my notes and in my reviewing some of this stuff, kratom was brought up. I had to pick and choose how much I was going to talk about. I could have thrown that in there, but I was afraid that would even add further possible confusion to this matter. Yes, that is part of the equation. Whoever that person was, if you'd like to reach out to me individually by that email, I'd be more than happy to look further into that myself, because I did stop. I will admit I did stop because, again, it's a rabbit hole that could go down thousands of feet. I mean, I was stunned at the amount of information I found. But kratom was mentioned. I didn't look that closely at it because I was really focusing more on the basic CBD portion of this. But you are correct. Kratom is part of the equation. In what level, I don't know yet. But feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to go back and forth a little bit. I'd be more than share some information with you about it as I find out about it.
All right, thanks, John. And then what about employees who work in the trucking industry but hold office or desk jobs?
Again, unless you fall under the safety sensitive portion of your work environment, you don't have to worry about it. So I don't think, Conrad, for example, not to put you on the spot, Conrad, I don't think you fall under our random drug testing policy.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume it would be up to the company at that point, whatever their policy is on the drug use at large.
Yeah, and yeah, basically, if you're not in a safety sensitive function, then you would not fall under that criteria. Yeah. So the short answer to your question, a clerical type of position with no safety sensitive function portion to it would not fall into that criteria.
And then we have another question here. Doesn't this vary company to company? Some companies do test all employees like CDL holders.
It could. Each company has individual policies. Yeah, it could. Going back to the termination of an employee that tests positive. It's not a given that it'll be terminated, but depending on company policy, would determine whether or not he is or not. So yes, it is company policy determinant.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So I'd just like to say in closing, whether from the logistical side or the regulatory side, managing a fleet is difficult and time consuming, but it doesn't have to be. Our AIM integrated logistics team works with companies of all sizes in several different industries to provide them with trucks, drivers, and decades of experience. Basically, if you distribute a product, we can help. And if you're interested in hearing more about this or any of our other transportation solutions, please reach out. And again, watch your inboxes for that follow-up email. And that's all we have today. And thank you for your time. And thank you, John, for lending us your expertise.
Thank you again. Have a nice day.
All right, thanks, John. You too.